Indie games have been repopularizing and reinventing many different genres in recent years. Amnesia with horror games, Spelunky with roguelikes, Slay the Spire with roguelikes that have cards. On occasion, though, games can create new genres all on their own. After 10 months in early access, Vampire Survivors officially released in 2022 and has since become the highest rated game of the year on Steam. The game has spread like wildfire and become massively popular among hardcore gamers, which is interesting because it shares more qualities with mobile games that are more interested in attracting casual gamers, low cost of entry, short gameplay loops, and frequent rewards. And this makes sense because the game's developer, Luca Galante, was initially inspired by mobile games with similarly simple and easy to replicate mechanics. The same factors that inspired the creation of Vampire Survivors and led to its massive popularity have spurred many other developers to create similar games in its wake. Since it's a relatively basic game to recreate, tons of games have been developed in the years since the game's initial early access release. Many of these by solo developers trying to get in on the success of the original game by innovating on it in different ways. The low barrier to entry for purchasing these games is due to the low barrier to entry for developing them, and has created a genre arms race that is moving much faster than usual. While few of these so-called Vampire Survivor clones have received even a fraction of the attention of the original game, they provide a look at a rapidly changing microcosm of game design innovation that has been very interesting to watch. I decided to examine most of the most popular games in this new genre to analyze what makes them unique in an enormous sea of competitors. While these dozen games all have changes to the original formula, most, if not all of them, share these characteristics with Vampire Survivors. Top-down automatic combat, horde mode survival, arena-style environments, roguelite aspects with short gameplay lengths, and lots of weapons and upgrades to choose from. How dramatically different each game's take on these foundational aspects are largely determines how different they feel to each other. All of these games were released between March and November of 2022, with most still being in early access. It's important to keep this in mind because I'll be talking about their current versions in December 2022 that will potentially be changed dramatically in the future. A few blanket statements right off the bat to save some time. Most of the following games have bosses that are improved over Vampire Survivors. In other words, they have actual abilities to interact with. Most of them give the player some kind of dash ability to support movement, and rerolls to support build crafting. Nearly all of them have multiple characters that are unlocked through completing challenges. Some have variable damage, like Vampire Survivors, while others use a life-based system where most or all hits count for the same amount of damage. Also, I'm only going to be focusing on the main modes of these games. Many of them have endless variations or even weirder modes that I feel are more like extras to the primary gameplay experience. To start off, it's worth examining the 4 games that have been the most widely played by a large margin to see what makes them stand out. At first glance, it might not seem like a big surprise that Brotato is the most successful game of the bunch. It wears its artistic and mechanical inspirations on its sleeve, drawing from 2 of the most popular indie roguelikes ever made. The game also has a more playful tone than those games and other games in its genre, with its name itself playing off the fact that the player character is a potato of all things. And the minimal dev resources needed to make it were actually a benefit to this, since a fully animated character and weapons wouldn't be nearly as funny as the potato with a look that changes based on the upgrades you pick and is surrounded by half a dozen firearms. The power progression over a session in most games in this genre revolve around evolving weapons to upgrade them through targeting specific items. Brotato doesn't exactly turn this on its head, as weapons are still combined to make them better, and focusing on specific types can lead to powerful synergies, especially when paired with certain characters. What it does change is the structure of how this progression grows over time. To start, while some items are locked behind achievements, most are available to the player immediately. This, combined with the fact that players can see synergies right off the bat, gives the player more freedom in how they choose to navigate the game from the start. Though it is worth noting that the synergies in Brotato are only stat increases, rather than visually or mechanically interesting changes to attacks. And achievements aren't completely for show, since like most of the other games here, they allow the player to unlock new characters and different base stats and advantages. In this sense, Brotato gets the best of both worlds by simplifying and flattening its progression curve, while still giving players something to shoot for. On the other hand, lacking meta progression besides character-based achievements can hurt the replay value of the game for some players, especially those who tend to be done with a game once they've unlocked everything they can. Another aspect of Brotato that's different from Vampire Survivors and similar games is the structure of the game itself. Rather than placing the player in an expansive arena with endless enemies, each session is split up into rounds, where the player earns money to be spent at the shop in between them. Spending their cash is how players will earn most of their upgrades, with levels providing the ability to earn random free passive items as a bonus. On the surface, it might seem like a dramatic change from the norm, but if you think about it, it's really not that different than the typical pop-up UI that pauses the game to spend experience on new abilities. What it does allow is more freedom and information for build crafting, with items having different costs and being able to see each item's usefulness in past rounds. Players can also sell their weapons in favor of purchasing new and improved ones. This allows players to learn and make changes over the course of a single play session, rather than being forced to commit to a build each game. In terms of the arena itself, the game only has one very basic map in at the moment that doesn't add much to the game experience, besides a few trees that can be hit for some extra cash. It can start to feel a bit stale and bland after several hours of playing when there isn't another map or mode to switch to like there is in Vampire Survivors, or other games in the genre. Hopefully more will be added in the future to keep Brotato interesting as more players experience it. But giving the player plenty of item options from the get-go and layering a simple coherent art style on top has been a very powerful combination for Brotato. This sense of familiarity, combined with simplicity that can be seen throughout its style and systems, has helped it to carve out its own space alongside Vampire Survivors and become a bit of a phenomenon in its own right. Like Brotato, it probably only takes a few clips from Soulstone Survivors to see where its ideas are inspired from. If the name didn't already give it away, it utilizes a similar progression structure to Vampire Survivors, with players upgrading their abilities throughout each match in a singular arena and spending currency outside of matches and meta progression to improve their overall stats and unlock new characters. And while Vampire Survivors evokes a similar feel to gaining power in Diablo, albeit at a much faster rate, Soulstone takes this one step further by replicating its flashy ability effects, classes, and elements of its UI and art. The transition to 3D adds a sense of weight and impact to spells that the other 2D games in the genre have a hard time competing with. Once a player gets towards the end of a match and there's VFX flying everywhere in classic Survivors fashion, Soulstone becomes a very satisfying and aesthetically pleasing game to watch. And this is across a variety of maps with different environmental aesthetics, something that's a rarity in the genre. But just because it's pretty doesn't mean that there's a lack of mechanical depth here. For one, enemies tend to have more varied attack patterns than the standard walk towards the player and damage them on contact. Some charge, some throw projectiles, some have area attacks, and the bosses can do any number of these in many different combinations. This helps avoid, for better or worse, a common trend in the genre, where players can stand still once they are powerful enough and ride out the rest of the game. And while all the effects are vibrant and interesting to look at, they can be pretty hard to detect with so much happening on screen, leading to some situations where getting hit can feel unfair. There are some balance issues too, especially at higher difficulty levels. Certain spells, I'm looking at you Chaos Golem, are significantly better than others, to the point where some become borderline useless. Since it has more to do with number tweaking and adjustments than something more systemic, hopefully these problems can be solved over the course of early access. In my opinion though, the biggest selling point and the feature that makes it stand out the most is Soulstone's deep meta progression. Players are able to navigate a branching skill tree, unlock new characters, and even craft new weapons. Some of these are earned by spending currencies only received by defeating certain bosses or playing on specific maps, rewarding players for getting better at the game and giving a reason to play maps more than once. Soulstone Survivors definitely feels like one of the most polished and feature-complete entries in the genre, and in doing so justifies its relatively higher price tag. Taking the action RPG aspects of Vampire Survivors and cranking them up to 11 made this one of the more enjoyable games in the genre for me. Sticking with the slicker-looking games of the bunch, 20 Minutes Till Dawn takes the traditional formula and focuses it around ranged weapons. Before each match, the player selects one from a varied arsenal, along with a character with a passive that can range from simply providing more health to changing into a rampaging deer after killing enough enemies. Now even at this stage, there are some crazy powerful synergies that can be created if you know which combinations to pick, but these reach a whole nother level after a few minutes of blasting through enemies in each match. 20 Minutes plays pretty differently to its competitors. To start, although there's an auto-aiming mode, I and many other players prefer to use the aiming feature that's more common in standard bullet hell games. Along with limited movement options, like not having a dash, this makes the game much more reliant on player skill than just picking the best upgrades, especially because health is very limited and can only be regained through specific upgrades. These factors make 20 Minutes one of the more active and difficult games out of all the Vampire Survivor clones. Like I was saying before, 20 Minutes looks a lot more stylish than Vampire Survivors and other games in the genre that you might be used to. The minimal color palette, consisting of many grays, blacks, and whites, on a purple background gives the game a distinct look that helps it to stand out. This art style plays into the gameplay as well, with a reddish pink being used to distinguish important items on the screen, like health and incoming enemy projectiles, so the player can easily notice them at a glance. And even though 20 Minutes Till Dawn chooses not to confine the player to a tiny arena, it doesn't make use of the space it has by placing items defined in the environment, whether they be related to health or other mechanics. Because of this, the player has no incentive to move around the level, and each match can start to feel confined and repetitive as a result. When players get further in, they'll be able to continually stack upgrades and form synergies, similar to evolutions in Vampire Survivors. These do provide guidance for specific combos to go for when selecting new items, but they don't feel quite as special because they are purely statistical buffs for the most part. This is a departure from the original evolution system, where the behaviors of attacks can be significantly changed and feel much more powerful, leading to the power curve in 20 minutes feeling less satisfying than in several of its peers. There's also a notable lack of a DPS counter at the end of matches, making it difficult to judge which synergies are more effective than others when planning builds. The meta progression involves purchasing upgrades where one from each row can be equipped at a time. These buffs are more than basic stat boosts and can be mixed and matched in a bunch of different combinations depending on which build you're aiming for. They almost feel more interesting and impactful than the in-match synergies, and I think that swapping both sets of buffs around in the future could make the power progression feel smoother. A uniquely active combat system in a field of auto-shooter games helps 20 Minutes Till Dawn stand out from the pack. Taken all together, it's absolutely one of the most unique visual and mechanical experiences in the genre so far. The last of the bigger Vampire Survivor clones is a game called Rogue Genesia. On the surface, it shares a lot of similarities with the original Vampire Survivors itself. A generic fantasy aesthetic, not much enemy variety, even using chicken as a healing item that can be looted in the environment. But if you dig a little deeper, you'll find that there really isn't that much that distinguishes Rogue Genesia from its inspiration. The central gimmick of the game is the addition of a Slay the Spire-esque branching path map in its main mode. Like in Slay the Spire, players can choose between battles, elite battles, shops, treasures, and events. And it all culminates as you'd expect, with a boss at the end, before moving on to another branching path section. It does help to break up combat sequences, similar to the shop screens in Brotato. Also similar to Brotato is how having multiple smaller battles, rather than a single longer one, adds a little frantic section at the end of each, where you have to scramble and try to get as much currency as possible before you're booted out of the level. Now you might have noticed me saying, like this game and like that game a lot when describing this one, and it's because there isn't much that really comes off as original in Rogue Genesia. One system that is slightly tweaked is the meta progression. It's a standard spend experience to get more stat point system, but it's split between difficulties, requiring more experience to level up stats on harder ones. Ultimately, it doesn't add much to the game and makes the whole system feel clunkier, since you'll be respeccing constantly, not to try out different builds, but to be effective whatsoever when you switch difficulty settings. And speaking of difficulty settings, the limited amount of viable weapons for killing bosses severely restricts build diversity when playing on harder ones. On top of an arsenal that isn't very visually or mechanically interesting, this hamstrings Rogue Genesia and can make it feel like a slog at times. There are a few upgrades which restrict the bonuses players can get for the rest of the run in exchange for massive stat bonuses, but these are few and far between, with most being some variation of a flat +1 stat and minus another. Without other aspects of Vampire Survivors, like multiple characters to unlock and a bunch of weapon evolutions to discover, I found myself getting tired of Rogue Genesia pretty quickly. It is one of the more popular games I played, so I'm glad people are enjoying it. On the other hand, it doesn't do much to set itself apart, unfortunately. Army of Ruin is one of those games that I can't really say much bad about. It's got plenty of features that should be commonplace, like multiple characters with unique abilities, weapon evolutions, and challenges to unlock content. Plus, it adds some seasoning on top with some cool features on its maps. The 3D cartoony art style and Spells and Orcs fantasy theme reminds me a lot of Soulstone Survivors. The UI, characters, enemies, and attacks all pop off the screen in a way that some might find a bit mobile gamey, but I didn't mind it since it's a good contrast to other games in the genre that typically have a dark and drab theme. This extends into its maps, which have a bunch of structures and objects strewn about that makes it feel like a lived-in world, or at least as much as a map can be in these games. It actually feels like they were generated with a bit of thought into level design, which is a stark contrast to other games that usually have one flat map. The obstacles can be useful or a hindrance to the player based on how they play, which is a neat addition to the standard formula. Another unique aspect of Army of Ruin is that power-ups are spawned in faraway locations, instead of dropped at the player's feet. This forces the player to explore the maps and holds off the classic stand-in-one-place problem until virtually the end of every match, where it gives you a cool little chart of how far you traveled to look back on. Matches are a bit short for the genre, clocking in around 10 minutes, and players have a more limited amount of slots for weapons and passives. Because the game has to be balanced around these factors, it's likely you'll be able to max out all your items quickly every game, which could be a negative for some players looking for an extended experience. I personally love it because it allows me to try out more upgrades faster and iterate on my builds without committing to a longer play session. My biggest gripes with the game would be that it can lean a bit on the easy side, especially early on, and meta progression is a basic Vampire Survivors stat boost setup. But besides that, Army of Ruin focuses on just about everything I want one of these clones to include, while adding a few extra things on top to keep it fresh. Boneraiser Minions is a game that leaves me conflicted. On the one hand, it has a unique hook and style of gameplay that makes it entirely unique in the genre. On the other hand, this uniqueness takes away from key aspects that define Vampire Survivor clones and doesn't look to replace them in any way. Matches take place in small arenas, similar to Brotato. Barring one class that can be unlocked, most player characters in Boneraiser don't actually have spells or weapons that are fired from their position. Instead, upgrades provide minions that follow the player and attack enemies around them. This places the player's sole attention on moving around the map and avoiding enemies. I do like how this style shakes up genre conventions by offering a different attack mechanism. Unfortunately, it also leaves the player a bit detached from the action, not great for a game based on another, where power fantasy is king. The in-match upgrades feel less meaningful because of the way the combat functions. Each minion can be leveled up or combined with other minions to make what are essentially evolutions of the original. Plus, the descriptions of these upgrades give a vague, non-numerical idea of what the changes will actually be, resulting in the player being largely misinformed when picking new ones. Items that can be one-time use abilities or game-long passives are similarly obtuse, since each one must be picked up before a description is even available. Even though the meta progression is expansive, with multiple upgrades per character on top of across-the-board upgrades, it also feels hard to quantify because combat is so nondescript in nature. How are you supposed to judge the worth of any given upgrade if you can't imagine how it will react in the game? Still, a variety of enemies and bosses elevates the gameplay and enhances replay value. A map mechanic that involves standing by chests to open them is also a welcome addition, making the player feel even more confined on the game's already tiny maps. Like I said before, Boneraiser Minions makes me feel conflicted. It both innovates on and rejects what makes Vampire Survivors and other clones so good. One thing I can absolutely say though is it's one of the most unique games of the bunch. With a different thematic spin on the formula, Bounty of One takes us out of generic Fantasyland to the paranormal Wild West. It has a couple other features that are pretty unique too, and is held back by some restrictions in its upgrade systems. One thing you'll instantly notice is that you can only fire when standing still. This puts a premium on knowing each enemy type and what they're capable of, so you can learn when to get a few hits in, rather than relying on always attacking. I don't have a hard stance either way about whether this is better than the traditional formula, but it does give a fresh take on what is normally expected in the genre, so I do appreciate how it changes the way you play. Though I wasn't able to test it, it's worth noting that this is one of the only Vampire Survivor clones at the moment to feature co-op. It seems like something that could shake up the game a bit, given everything is more fun with friends. I have read that there are some issues with only one player being able to select upgrades from a few reviews, so there may still be some kinks to work out. I'll leave it at that for now, though. My issues with the game start to appear when looking at the progression systems. Unlike other games in the genre, players in Bounty of One are restricted to one weapon based on the character they choose at the start of a match. This severely limits which upgrades can be available throughout a match to primarily weapon stat buffs, pickup radius buffs, and dash modifiers with different rarities. The advantage to this system is there's less of a reliance on getting an exact build, so it reduces the RNG that any given player will have a bad game through no fault of their own. In my opinion, this trade-off isn't worth it because of how it drastically impacts build crafting and finding powerful combinations in a negative way. It removes a lot of the wonder, shock, and surprise I get out of these games when all I'm hoping for is a purple attack speed boost the whole game. The meta progression isn't much better, sadly. Most of these games have basic stat boost upgrades which are honestly fine with me, and Bounty of One isn't different. It's that even after hours of playing and winning matches, I have nowhere near enough currency to upgrade in any significant way because of how expensive and relatively small the changes are. Like the in-match upgrades, it makes me less inclined to think about different ways to build my run, and more likely to pick whatever I can get at the time and stick with it. Bounty of One made me realize how much I value progression in a Vampire Survivor clone. Even though the gameplay and enemy variety forces the player to think ahead, the upgrade options do exactly the opposite. One game that I can't believe doesn't get more attention is Neon Sundown. It takes a more traditional bullet hell formula with ship-on-ship combat and uses it to separate itself from the rest of the genre, while still building on its inspiration. Neon sports a flashy, yet simple art style that suits the genre, especially when all the projectiles start flying around. I admire this aesthetic a lot because it makes the player feel powerful when they get fully upgraded, and doesn't rely on detailed character sprites to get it done. Gameplay itself uses a combination of aiming for the main weapon, like in 20 Minutes Till Dawn, while relying on Vampire Survivors' automatic randomness to handle the others, making its combat feel frenetic. Experience from destroyed enemies is automatically collected no matter how far away they are from the player. The matches themselves are quick too, usually maxing out around 10 to 15 minutes. Applying a fast pace to the micro and macro aspects of matches lets the player feel the excitement of a classic Survivor-style game in an even shorter time period than usual. Upgrades get handed out at a similarly rapid rate, with weapon synergies appearing quickly in matches. This is key to Neon's longevity because the amount of basic weapons available is severely lacking compared to other games in the genre. To prevent the player from maxing out too early, Neon Sundown features synergy trees that can be used to plan out upgrade routes and eventually combine synergies into even more powerful combinations. If you can get a few of these going at once, the game gets really flashy really quick and nails the sense of power that games in the genre should shoot for. It still can be a bit restrictive, however, as the synergies are so powerful and require so many upgrades that you can feel funneled into certain builds after a while. And enemy scaling doesn't always keep up with these synergies, with the mid-game sometimes feeling like you don't need to add much input to still be successful. It wraps around quickly in the endgame though, and can take the player by surprise if they aren't careful. Meta progression follows suit with the rest of the game and is fairly fast to level up. Players can't use all of their upgrades at once though, since a maximum of 4 can be chosen before every match. Depending on player preference, this can limit the sense of progression they feel over multiple matches. For me, it served a good balance so that I didn't feel overpowered after a couple matches, but could still prioritize and switch around upgrades when I needed to. With a variety of ships with different primary weapons, and maps with unique modifiers to choose between as they gain more experience, players will find themselves in a sea of choice when choosing how to play Neon Sundown. The freedom and options, along with the fast pace of practically every aspect of the game, cuts down on the grind and makes it one of my favorite Vampire Survivor clones on the market at the moment. It might not be as endlessly replayable, but it gets to the fun right away, and I can really respect that. Project Lazarus is flashy like many other Vampire Survivor clones, but in a different way. While its weapons and projectiles are pretty to watch, the real visual and gameplay appeal comes from piloting a mech with an entire arsenal attached to it. See, unlike most of these games, new weapons in Lazarus are additional models on top of the player's character, adding a sense of physicality where there would otherwise not be. Later in the game, this can get wild as more and more upgrades get piled onto the mech, making it look virtually unrecognizable. I enjoy how this provides a distinct way of visualizing the progression of power over a match without distracting from the gameplay itself. Being a giant walking robot, gameplay is slower than other games in the genre and notably lacks a dash mechanic. With only one passive speed upgrade to compensate, the limited movement feels more sluggish than interesting in a genre where moving around is what the player is doing most of the time. Along with many weapons having cooldown periods, this means players have to be even more careful of where they're planning to move because the margin of error is much slimmer and taking damage is more common. The overall aesthetic is a more realistic, high-definition counterpart to the pixel graphics of most other games in the genre. It definitely makes it stand out, but leads to the maps and enemies feeling more generic than they already are. Without the variety of a game like Soulstone Survivors or Army of Ruin, Lazarus largely falls flat in these departments, with the unique aspects of the game centering around the mech itself. Along these lines, in-match upgrades and meta progression is focused on improving individual weapons and passives, rather than improving overall stats. This has benefits and drawbacks. On one hand, players can more easily focus on their specific favorite playstyle to make it more viable later in the game. On the other, none of the upgrades besides rerolls actually make it more likely that the upgrades a player chose to improve will actually show up, potentially pigeonholing them further and relying more on luck at the start of any given game. I enjoyed Project Lazarus, especially for the first few hours, though without being a hardcore mech fan, I'm not sure how much longer the game would be able to hold me with its relatively shallow gameplay depth and progression. Now, I've called all these games clones of Vampire Survivors because of their similarities in mechanics, price, and how close their release date was to the original game. However, none of them capture the chaotic feeling of cleaving through hordes of enemies quite like Spellbook Demonslayers. The exponential power curve and crazy evolutions are all here. Spellbook is the most faithful of all the games I played in trying to replicate the original feeling I had when first playing Vampire Survivors. There's a diverse variety of characters, spells, passives, and evolutions that all feel meaningful to choose between because of how crazy they are on average in the endgame. It's the feeling of, oh, this is going to be game-breaking you get for some items in other games, but in Spellbook it applies to most of them. There's even a category of upgrade that's labeled illegal that you only get from a special smuggler and have the potential to truly change how the game is played by dramatically changing character stats and the availability of certain cards. Enemies, on the other hand, aren't as diverse. Most are the generic walk towards the player and damage on contact type, and there aren't any true bosses, only mini-bosses with modifiers. This could make the gameplay get stale fast if not for the previously mentioned crazy builds that are possible as well as the main gimmick of the game. Most Survivor clones feature generic flat maps with nothing in the way of interesting design or locations. Spellbook handles this problem by spawning in shrines, which are locations where if the player stands in them and kills enough enemies, they get a limited time buff. The player can build up and have multiple shrine buffs at once, and even modify them to last longer or spawn more often through in-match upgrades. This is another method, like the money trees in Brotato, that succeeds in motivating and rewarding the player for moving around even after they become a graphics card melting god later on in matches. In terms of meta progression, Spellbook is fair and players can level up pretty quickly. There's the typical stat boosts that get more expensive the more they're invested in, which provide nice buffs across the board. And players can also spend to improve individual upgrades like in Project Lazarus, if they want to focus on a more specific build. This best of both worlds approach gives more freedom to every individual player, and supports those who like to switch up builds frequently, as well as those who'd prefer to stick with and specialize in a few abilities. It also features some neat accessibility options, including multiple aiming methods and the ability to modify the speed of gameplay. Basically, no other games in the genre allow for as much customization in how you play, which is understandable given the constraints on budgets and developers. Which makes it even more impressive that this developer pulled them off and did it well. Spellbook Demonslayers takes what works from Vampire Survivors and expands on it, while still providing a gameplay experience that feels faithful to the original. It might not be the most original or thematic game here, but it nails what it tries to do. With meta progression being one of the defining features of this genre, it was only a matter of time until one game went off the deep end. To this effect, Spirit Hunter's Infinite Horde decided to go full Path of Exile and build a massive unlock tree. This thing is so huge that it likely takes dozens upon dozens of hours to fully uncover. It's a great way to contextualize and offer more player choice regarding the unlocks that are common in Survivor clones. And with two separate currencies, one for main unlocks and one for upgrading them, players never have to sacrifice getting new things for improving older ones. It does make the game a bit grindy though, and with the bland in-match gameplay compared to its competitors, some might not want to spend the time unlocking everything. I don't think every game needs a progression system this extensive, but it can potentially keep the meta aspect of the game fresh for quite a long time. When starting a game, players select a character and a spell that can be mixed and matched. Each character will have a primary effect that's modified by the spell that's selected along with them. Simply adding an extra choice before each match contributes so much to the freedom with builds and room for experimentation, since there might be multiple optimal weapons for each character. The actual in-match gameplay is where Spirit Hunters does start to lack though. Enemy and boss design is typical for the genre, big bars of health walking towards the player. On the progression end, none of the spells really get modified enough or combined in a way that makes them look more powerful. They do get mechanically upgraded, of course, it's just a little lame that they don't get the same treatment visually. In terms of the level, there are a few map mechanics that switch up the gameplay. For instance, chests require the player to stay in a given area for a certain amount of time, before their rewards are dropped, pressuring players into high-stakes scenarios. On top of this, there are shops where an in-match currency can be spent to gain more health, meta progression currency, or other upgrades. Besides Brotato, shops aren't a very common feature in Survivor clones, and I think they really do contribute to the build crafting and random upgrade elements of the genre in a substantial way. It might not be the flashiest or most fun game of the bunch, but some solid design decisions and an enormous skill tree make Spirit Hunter's Infinite Horde a nice base to build off of in early access, even if the name is probably a bit longer than it needs to be. From a game that focuses on meta progression to one that's all core gameplay, Void Scrappers is one of the fastest games currently in the Vampire Survivor clone genre. Like Neon Sundown, Void Scrappers has players controlling various ships, combating other ships at a rapid pace. Tight turns and diving in between packs of enemies feels more precise in this game than most others in the genre. The movement almost feels more unique than the weapons, which is a blessing and a curse. Build diversity at this point feels very limited to prioritizing one of a few weapon types in each match. This is made even worse by certain characters only being optimal with specific builds, since some of their passives are based around one weapon type. Enemy types don't provide much outside of the norm either, leaving the combat feeling largely unfinished. The standard meta progression doesn't help much on this front either. While unlocking new characters by doing challenges is fun, upgrading damage by 2% just isn't. And since that's basically the entirety of between match progression, there's not much to keep players around once they get tired of the fast-paced gameplay loop. With some more work on expanding its progression systems, both in and out of matches, Void Scrappers could become one of the better games in the genre. Until then, it lacks the distinct replayability factor that makes its competitors so addicting. While many of these games are relatively small and still in active development, analyzing them gives us a chance to see how many different developers iterate on a similar concept. In a sense, it's like a giant game jam, where everyone throws out ideas to see what sticks. Vampire Survivors has clearly left a mark on the industry that has been visible in 2022 and may last for many years to come. Its widespread popularity proves that the next great idea in gaming can truly come from anywhere.